It is truly an honor to welcome you during your visit to Washington. Your remarks have given us a lot to talk about, and especially you have already addressed, as we say in the United States, the elephant in the room, the knot in our stomachs about the future of the transatlantic relationship and the NATO alliance. Understanding that with your visit to the White House yesterday and meetings with President Trump, Secretary Rubio, and Secretary Hegseth, obviously in many ways, diplomatic dialogues need to remain private in order to work. But what can you share with us from those conversations as we think about the future of the alliance?
Yes. Well, I mean, as is often said in diplomatic circles, those conversations were frank and open. Which is good.
I mean, they could be honest.
They were sincere and open. That's good because we're among friends. The president and I like each other. We've been good friends for many years. And I would have preferred to talk openly about the subject instead of beating around the bush. And I could clearly see his deep disappointment when he realized that many allies were no longer directly supporting him. And I explained it to him yesterday. I said, look, sir, Mr. President, clearly the vast majority of Europeans ended up doing exactly what the United States asked them to do and what had already been agreed upon under these circumstances. And yes, sometimes it takes a little time. But look, in Europe we have coalitions, so domestic politics can sometimes take a few more days. But then we come together. And almost all of Europe stood alongside the United States. This served to project power on the world stage through its partners in Europe. And the other one, NATO protects both the European Union and the United States. As the Prime Minister of Norway, Jonas Støre, said, that's exactly it. Russia's enormous nuclear submarines aren't there to attack Norway, but the United States. Thanks to the alliance, we prevent them from positioning themselves for that. So that's just one example of how the continental United States and Europe become stronger and safer because of the alliance. It was a good conversation. It was open and frank. And I clearly felt his disappointment, which again, to some extent, I understand.
The president certainly made his disappointment clear. He made new appeals for the United States to consider withdrawing from NATO. It's important to remember, however, that the challenge of the United States' participation in NATO is not necessarily something new. I always remember your earliest predecessor, the first Secretary General of NATO, who said that the challenge of the alliance might be that the purpose of NATO is to keep the Russians out and the Americans in. What case did you make to the president about keeping the Americans engaged? What argument would you make about the importance of NATO? And what is the value proposition for them?
Sometimes we begin with the wrong value proposition. The wrong view, in my personal opinion, is that NATO was fundamentally established because the United States wanted to avoid isolationism after World War II, repeating what had happened in a way after World War I. In a famous speech by Churchill at the end of December at the Zarua Congress, he said, once again, for the second time in the 20th century, the long arm of history reaches out to the new world to come to the defense of the old, and we are not going to repeat that mistake. To stay safe and for the United States to remain safe, you need a secure Europe, but also a secure Arctic and Atlantic. Otherwise, Russians and others become a threat. And we already know, let's not be naive, that you can't separate what happens in the Pacific from what happens in the Atlantic. Oh, is it China and North Korea and the Russians working together with Iran when it comes, for example, to the war effort, to Russia's unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine? They work together. So this is worldwide and we need to work together. I'm not advocating for NATO to expand into the Indo-Pacific, but the fact that we have such close cooperation with Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand is clear evidence of that. So, for all these reasons, my family lives in the United States, and they are, in part, Americans by birth, and others came here after World War II. They feel deeply that for the U.S. to remain safe, we need to stay united, and we need this transatlantic partnership.
One of the things we do at the Reagan Institute is conduct opinion research with the American people. Our data from a few months ago, before the current moment, especially with Iran, shows that most Americans have a favorable view of NATO. 70% in our last survey, which is about 10 points higher than the usual number in our surveys. The majority also opposes the United States withdrawing from NATO, and so some of these messages, I think, are repeated. Let's move on to Iran and talk about the situation there. You mentioned that it's good that Iran's nuclear capability has been degraded and that their ability to export chaos has been degraded. The president, of course, has been very critical of NATO allies, in particular, for not sufficiently supporting efforts in Iran. Now we are on the second day of what is expected to be a 2-week ceasefire. The Strait of Hormuz continues. Activity is still quite limited even with the ceasefire, but this coalition of European nations that signed on to lead efforts to ensure freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz share with us some specific details as you understand them. Which countries are standing out and which others not so much? Which countries are standing out? What are they going to provide in the Strait of Hormuz? Yes. And what about the countries that are not participating yet?
Yes. So I think there are two elements to point out. Reaction to my answer. One is, it has always been NATO's long-standing position that Iran should not acquire nuclear capability, but also should not acquire ballistic missile capability. And the fact that under the leadership of the US Armed Forces, these capabilities have been severely degraded is good news. News of existential importance for Israel, the Middle East, Europe, and the whole world. And I know there are those who have called for it to continue. But look, we know what happened with North Korea. There may come a time when you've negotiated so much that, guess what? North Korea managed to get its hands on nuclear capability. And then it was already too late. So NATO has always made it clear that Iran must not, under any circumstances, gain access to these capabilities. So when the ESEG started the campaign at the end of February, on that last Saturday of February, there were already long-standing agreements and arrangements with the European allies. Regarding overflight use of bases, there are examples of European countries that had to close their commercial airports because they needed to receive tanker aircraft. From the United States, that's fine. I mean, these are the agreements made beforehand, exactly what we need. This is also the United States using Europe, as I said, as a platform for projecting power, and that's part of the agreement. Not all European nations, but most of them followed, sometimes with a delay. Part of the explanation was the fact that the president wanted to keep the element of surprise, which I understand, but that meant there was no prior consultation, so they had to rush to understand what was happening and act quickly. But when it comes to this issue of Ramis, it was Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, who took the lead here, and he said, "We need to bring together a coalition of countries that is collectively capable of ensuring that the principle of free navigation and free movement in our seas, as set out in UNCLOS, is respected." And obviously that means discussing with the United States what the mission will be, where it will take place, and when. But this is about practical support. It's about the announcement my country, the Netherlands, made yesterday that it will probably involve mine hunters, frigates, and radar technology. So each country is now looking at what it can do to contribute and ensure that the Strait of Hormuz remains open. Of course, it's still very early. As you said, it's only been 2 days since the ceasefire. So we need to see what happens with the shipping routes day by day. The president is very committed to reopening the maritime routes as soon as possible. This is practical support, first with the campaign and now at this stage to ensure that the principle of freedom of navigation is maintained. And that's why we have allies, coalitions, and this doesn't just involve NATO countries, but also includes Japan, Korea, and Australia. Countries like Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates in the Gulf region are part of this, but of course the vast majority of the countries are NATO countries.
There are reports that the president is considering withdrawing American troops from specific NATO countries as punishment for those who have not stepped up their support for the reporter's efforts in Iran. Historically, the military presence of the United States in Europe serves as a deterrent. How do you assess the impact if American troops were removed?
Well, as I said, he was disappointed yesterday, but he had a very frank and open conversation between friends. Overall, I understand that the United States wants to focus more and more on the Indo-Pacific. That's why in Europe we need to make more of an effort. We need to end this period of codependence to become more interdependent with the United States, with a stronger Europe and a stronger NATO, which is important, of course, over time. When we reach that point, it's about ensuring that as Europeans take on more responsibilities, the USA and AWA make sure they can also deal with threats in the Pacific region. And of course, here in our own hemisphere, in a way that when it comes to essential capabilities and support, we always remain strong as an alliance. But everyone agrees with that. There's no debate about that.
You just published your new annual report. And unlike many annual reports, this one contains some truly historic news, because NATO annual reports, or rather annual reports from any organization, usually aren't very engaging, but this one is. That's exactly it. The Allies are already meeting the 2% defense spending target, yes. And European allies and Canada increased defense spending by 20% in a single year. But as I just said, what matters is turning that capital into capability. What is the way forward? What do you look for to know if this increase in spending will produce the strong alliance we need?
Yes, those numbers are impressive. Imagine that countries like Belgium, Spain, Italy, and Canada, major economies, weren't even reaching 2%. They all reached 2% at once. I would say that without President Trump, I doubt they would do that in 9 or 12 months. That's billions and billions more. For Italy, that's an increase of 10 billion in defense in 1 year. The alliance committed to 5% at the summit in The Hague, and we need a credible path. It's not just hovering around 2% and then in 2034 jumping from 2 to 5. No, it has to be a credible path. That's what we're going to pursue in Ankara. Ankara will focus on industrial production and celebrate those countries as well. Numbers, but also making sure that as an alliance we can collectively reach that genuinely credible path together. The good thing is that under my predecessor, Jens Stoltenberg, when the 2% pledge made in Wales, that number was kind of pulled out of nowhere. These 5%, including 5% in central spending and 1.5% related to defense, are rooted in the plans for when Article 5 is triggered. We hope it never happens, but if there is an attack on NATO territory, the plans define who does what, where, and what is needed. So all countries like the Netherlands and Germany know that this is a list of NATO's requirements. When you add everything up for core defense spending, the 3.5% or the total spending of 5%, that's more or less the number you need, that usually varies around 3.5% for core defense. Overall, each country knows what it needs to do, and it's not just about spending more. The problem is defense industrial production, including here in the United States. Is it a problem in Europe? Look, shipbuilding in the United States, but also in Europe, is an issue. The Chinese now have more ships sailing than the United States, and we know that China is investing heavily in its defense. We look at Russia as an adversary, but we must also keep an eye on China's actions. Thus, defense industrial production becomes crucial. I predict that over time, you will see parts of our industry, maybe in the United States, but perhaps even earlier in Europe, adopting a more wartime-oriented mindset. Not to prepare for war, but to ensure that you are able to replenish stocks, also making use of the traditional industrial base, not just the defense industrial base, because we really are in a tight race here, and we need to get this right very soon.
When it comes to this industrial cooperation through the Transatlantic Alliance, moving, as you said in your comments, from a harmful codependency to a partnership, what does that look like? And in particular, since we're speaking mainly to an American audience, with many CEOs and defense industry executives in the room, what do you need to see from the American industrial base to build this healthy partnership you're seeking, whether from industry partners or from the government side, from business leaders?
Well, first, produce more, add extra shifts, install new lines, and when necessary, build factories. Don't talk about 10-year contracts, because in the ZOE system, there's a 1-year cycle. In the European system, there's an election cycle of 3 or 4 years. But the money exists. You mentioned the 20% increase. Look at how much the Europeans spend on zigzag. It was 10 billion in 2020. It was already 43 billion in 2024 buying from Europe for the industrial base of the United States, and this is going to increase massively, not to mention what the United States itself will need to buy, given the huge increase in the defense budget here in the United States under the leadership of Trump. So do that, and secondly, work together. And I know there are many examples of American companies investing in Europe, setting up factories, for example, factories in southern Bavaria to produce interceptors. And there are many such examples, but there are also European ones like Thales, like, for example, Leonardo. In other words, many cases, I mean many companies from Turkey, for example, investing in the United States and working together. There is a transatlantic defense industrial base, and the two sides are inseparable. There is no other way, because it would only benefit Russia in the short term and China in the long term. And we can't allow that.
I'm going to move on to questions from our audience. Now, to wrap up my initial questions, let's talk about Ukraine. General David Petraeus, a retired United States general, said in an interview earlier this week that he believes Russia no longer has the strategic advantage, and that in recent months, the Ukrainians have made greater incremental advances than the Russians. Do you agree with this assessment? Is Ukraine winning the war? And secondly, have you been involved with President Zelensky and President Trump in the peace process in Ukraine? Again, without betraying any confidences, what gives you hope and what concerns you about the future of the war in Ukraine?
Regarding the first question, my view is a bit more nuanced. It's true that Russia loses a lot of people every month, about 30 to 35,000 killed or seriously wounded each month. Can you imagine that? The Soviets in the 1980s lost less than 20,000 in 10 years in Afghanistan, and now they're losing that in 3 weeks. That's huge. That can't happen. And this needs to somehow reach Moscow and St. Petersburg. You can't try to contain this to the parts of Russia that won't be reached by the mainstream media. This will have an impact on Russia, no doubt. But on the other hand, overall, the front line is moving in the wrong direction slowly and at an extreme cost. The Ukrainians are defending themselves firmly and are using the most advanced technology. I mentioned it in my introduction. There's drone technology, and that gives them immense power, of course. And also, when it comes to drones and counter-drone systems, they really need to make progress in that area. But in general, you can still see that things are slowly moving in the wrong direction if you're pro-Ukraine like I am and anti-Russia. As for the second question, I still think we need an agreement for that, a peace treaty. That's what President Trump is seeking. He broke the deadlock with Putin last year. Ao se envolver com ele. He, Steve Witkoff, and Jared Kushner are working day and night together with Marco Rubio to achieve this. And we all understand that the key to unlocking this is for Ukraine to know that after a peace agreement, joining NATO is off the table. For now, there will be security guarantees so strong that they will know the Russians won't try to attack again. And at the beginning of January in Paris, there was a meeting with all the countries that are part of the coalition of the willing, including the main interlocutor with the United States. We agreed on a three-layered approach. The first layer is the Ukrainian armed forces. They must be as strong as possible with huge investments from Europe and from the Ebers and Indayat for their defense. The coalition of the willing, made up mainly of European and non-European nations, has the US providing support. It's a strong package of security guarantees. This is vital to unlock the debate about the endpoint for peace. But of course, it takes two to tango, doesn't it? Besides, Putin has to get in the game, and of course, this is also testing how serious he is about moving this forward.
Some argue that the military presence of the Semiles in Europe is out of step with the current perception of threats, including aspects that go beyond Ukraine. Today we have Washington Post columnist Mark Thiessen, who sees the Russian threat moving eastward and argues that US citizens should keep up with this change. What's your view? NATO's eastern flank is vulnerable, and we should have more allied forces positioned in places like Romania.
No, of course, as I saw in the previous session with Stoltenberg, in the countries on the eastern flank, we now have what we call in the NATO Parliament forward land forces. And these are multinational forces helping to defend. For example, Latvia, where Canada is leading, Estonia, where the United Kingdom is leading, Poland, where the United States is leading, and Lithuania, where my country, the Netherlands, is operating under the leadership of Germany. So this is a way to ensure that all these countries on the eastern flank have, in addition to their own national armed forces and, of course, the general protection of NATO's Article 5, what they need to defend themselves. And, of course, you need to use your limited resources in the best possible way. That's an ongoing debate. Where should you position the troops? What is, after all, the best way to do this? I leave that mainly to the military. We are here, by the way, with Alexis Grinkovich, codename Grinch, the new Supreme Allied Commander Europe, and also the commander of the US forces in Europe. We have an incredible senior commander, a 4-star general, who is constantly with his team evaluating the best way to use all the resources of the US and Europe to protect the continent.
My last question before the audience, let's finish by talking about our namesake. You mentioned President Reagan in your comments in Europe. You already did that in meetings with President Trump. You mentioned you grew up with Ronald Reagan in a way. What does President Reagan's legacy mean to you? And in particular, with NATO's challenges, which principle or idea from President Reagan should we remember? What is most important?
The absolute total clarity of focus from the day he took office until he left the presidency in 1988 and handed over to Bush, to Herbert Walker Bush, who then carried on that legacy. And in the end, he saw the Berlin Wall fall. That leadership, above all, total clarity of focus, which is we need to win the Cold War to end it by winning. There is no other way. And he knew that Maggie Thatcher had the best possible ally in Europe in the United Kingdom. This special relationship that is so important for the alliance and for the whole transatlantic community. And it was Maggie Thatcher at that time who was rebuilding her country. Don't forget that in the 1970s, the United Kingdom was more or less run by the unions. And she managed, by fighting against the coal miners' union, to take back the Falklands from Argentina in 1982. She was a strong leader. And that relationship, those two deeply understanding the priceless value of democracy, of freedom, and that power, I think that's what brought us here. But there is also the legacy of diplomacy. When the Berlin Wall fell, it was Bush who understood that he couldn't celebrate that, and he was criticized for it here in the United States. Why aren't you celebrating the fact that thanks to your leadership and that of the previous president, President Reagan, you brought down the Berlin Wall? He understood that for Gorbachev to survive at such an important moment, he couldn't celebrate that so openly. And that's also a kind of leadership, and I really admire Bush as well. But above all, Reagan's role, and of course there are so many funny stories about that relationship, but I'll save that for lunch. But as Maggie used to say, she would assert herself in the White House and throughout the entire American administration. Tell the president what you think. You have to say no to the president, Prime Minister. Yes, I will. You have to say no. Hello, Ronnie. First, a private meeting. She went into the Oval Office for an hour. They came out, and he gave in to everything the Prime Minister wanted. The staff said, you were going to say no to her. You don't say no to Maggie. And well, that's also the sweet part of this relationship. And we all benefited from the fact that these two extraordinary leaders were in charge of the world in the 1980s.
Yes. Let's talk to the audience. We have microphones here for questions. Let's start in the back and then come to the front. Thank you very much. I have a question. Alina Shirazi from the Daily Mail. So, based on your conversation with the president yesterday, do you think he will still remain in NATO since you know him so well? And secondly, do you still consider him your father after what happened yesterday?
About this daddy thing, it was a language mix-up. Here's what happened. I need to explain it to you. Because this haunts me a little. I can assure you. Actually, the president and I had a pre-summit meeting in The Hague in June of last year. On that particular day, he was feeling quite irritated with the issues regarding Iran and also Israel. And in Dutch, you would say, hey, your father translates as daddy. And I said, hey, yes. Sometimes daddy needs to get angry, so I wasn't calling him my daddy, but I was saying, But daddy also has a special connotation, and now I have to live with that for the rest of my life. And I own that, and the president does too, because he released t-shirts. He made a movie called Daddy's Home when he came back to the United States. It was so funny, and that's why I like him so much. But yeah, you make mistakes, and that happens when you're not a native speaker. Sorry about that, really sorry. No. Again, like I said, the conversation was really open. It was really between friends, but it was also very clear. His disappointment. Right here in front.
Yes. Good morning.
The former Italian ambassador to the Allies. Good evening.
Thank you for your comments. And you mentioned the United Kingdom's initiative to bring together European and other forces to ensure the security of the Strait. And as Secretary General of NATO, considering that the alliance has a significant presence in the Middle East, from Jordan to Kuwait and even Iraq, do you see a role that NATO could play as a coordinating force, also to demonstrate its value to President Trump, who is asking for this, and considering that the next summit in Ankara is a strategic move in the region? How do you see this unfolding? Thank you.
I would say we should do this step by step, but quickly. And the step that's being taken now is for this coalition. Now, 34 countries met at the military level last Tuesday to start detailed planning of what this huge mission could be. That's the first step. If NATO can help, obviously NATO will be there. There's no reason not to be helpful. Obviously, we'll do it if it's helpful. But NATO, I think we have to do this step by step, because in NATO, this also requires an agreement among all the allies. And I think here the exact structure is less important than the speed. Here I would say that speed prevails over perfection. But again, if NATO can play a role, that would be great.
Secretary General, thank you for those words of leadership. I appreciate it. Well, at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, we research how China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea are cooperating with each other.
Which is far from Iran. So there is a certain distance which shows that Iran is close to actually having operationalized this technology. And that's why I consider it essential that the United States has degraded these capabilities, both nuclear and ballistic missile capabilities. But it's technology going to Russia, money coming from Russia to Iran. Ambassador Markarova.
Thank you, former Ambassador of Ukraine. Thank you, Mark, for your excellent leadership at NATO and before that. But thank you, Brad, for the excellent question. Considering that our enemies really cooperate and work together, side by side, not only in Ukraine, but in other places as well. Do you think that Ukraine's drone capabilities and others are the answer to so many problems, not just there? The transatlantic bridge between Ukraine, Europe, and the United States requires renewed diplomacy. Discussions about Ukraine's accession to NATO? I know it's not being discussed right now, but preparation and everything else can make us stronger, and Ukraine can contribute to NATO in the best possible way.
Yes. Okay. So, at the NATO summit in Washington, when NATO was celebrating its 75th anniversary, there was an agreement on Ukraine's irreversible path to NATO. But the fact is that some countries are holding back, including Germany, Slovakia, Hungary, and the United States. So I don't think that's up for discussion right now, and that's just being practical. But also President Zelensky, being a practical man, had to shift NATO's focus to what comes next, to ensure that the Russians don't attack after a ceasefire, or even better, a peace agreement. That's the concept of security guarantees that are being discussed now. I don't think we'll be able collectively to solve this issue of joining NATO. In the short term, I don't believe this will happen politically, and that's the fair assessment. As for Ukraine's capabilities, we are very impressed. We are capturing all these lessons to incorporate them into NATO's defense plans, especially when it comes to drones and anti-drone technology, where you are the experts. So this is evidence that Ukraine is really standing out and also using its capabilities and skills right now when it comes to the Middle East region. Let's go back to the side of the room in the last row and then to the middle.
I'm Paul McClary with Politico. Thanks for coming.
Hello, good morning.
Good morning. The Trump administration has spent the past year telling NATO to stay out of the Middle East and the Indo-Pacific region, focusing on Europe and Russia. Now it demands that NATO help with operations in the Middle East. This is causing confusion among the allies about what exactly the administration is asking for and how to act quickly to meet their needs.
Well, I think that the thinking on Zeola's side is also constantly evolving when it comes, for example, to the Indo-Pacific region. It's true that for a while there was the idea that you should focus more on your own region. And of course, there's always talk about focus over synergy. First, solve your own problems. NATO wasn't at 2% and now it needs to reach 5%. Before those decisions, I fully accepted Zelashiwa's view that focus comes before synergy. But now that we've resolved some of these issues at the NATO summit, and now that the whole alliance has reached that 2% level, the foundation is set. What I also hear in US and European circles is that most likely, if China decided to act against Taiwan, why not? First, call their junior partner in all of this, which is Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, residing in Moscow, and ask him to keep us busy here. So most likely it won't be limited to the Indo-Pacific. It will be a matter of multiple theaters, and that means my chief of staff was in Japan last week delivering messages, and I am constantly in touch with the 4 partners in the Pacific. By the way, the distance between Japan and Australia is greater than between Japan and Brussels, but we still see this as a single theater in the Pacific, which says something about the size of the globe. But look, this is important. Because you can't analyze these theaters separately, they are interconnected.
We have time for a few more questions. Let's go to the middle, back there.
Morgan Phillips from Axios.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning. There seem to be some disagreements between the US and Europe about what NATO's obligations are regarding the conflict with Iran. After your meeting with President Trump, do you think the US and Europe are aligned on what NATO's obligations are?
Yes, and it's not so much about NATO. Actually, it's about the allies. NATO may come to play a role, as the Italian ambassador mentioned, but it's about what the allies expect from each other. The US expects that when using bases and infrastructure in European countries, those countries will fulfill their commitments. And the good news is, guess what? Most of them have fulfilled them, not all, but the vast majority of them. NATO countries in the Arctic and other allies ensuring that the region remains secure, working with Canada and Jefferson Exxon through NORAD and NORSCOM. This effort, started at the end of January, will help defend the Arctic, including Greenland, from Russian and Chinese influence. So that's one part. The other part is that Denmark, Greenland, and the US maintain bilateral and trilateral dialogues, focusing on what happens if Greenland in the future changes its constitutional position within the Kingdom of Denmark. Would the agreement still be valid? That's a fair question, which deserves an answer. This is solvable. And secondly, how to prevent Russia and China from gaining access to Greenland's economy. These conversations are ongoing.
Mr. Secretary General, as we wrap up our conversation today, I would like to finish by completing a quote that Dave started in his introduction.
Remarks by President Reagan in his 1988 speech to the citizens of Western Europe. As Dave said, the Atlantic Alliance is the fundamental core of American foreign policy and of America's own security. He continued, "A peaceful and democratic Europe is essential for the security of the United States. If our sister democracies are not secure, we won't be either." This is not simply a matter of treaty language, important as treaties are. It is an enduring reality, as enduring President Reagan said, as the reality that a threat to the security of the state of Maine, New York, or California is a threat to the security of all 50 American states. And then he said, simply put, an attack on Munich is the same as an attack on Chicago. That was how President Reagan saw the NATO alliance. Mr. Secretary, thank you for preserving the alliance and for your presence with us today. Thank you, thank you, thank you.